All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon. Professor Barry here. We are now into week one, the start of our journey into the sociology of popular culture. So let's get started. Just kind of review real quick, review kind of the format of your write-up that you will submit and turn it in. This is pretty much, we'll continue with this format for each week throughout the course of the term. I provide in week one folder, you'll see this handout provides questions over the articles or videos or podcasts that we have for the week. That's in section one. That's the supplementals part. And then there's the lecture part. And in the lecture, I organize things around themes. And in your write-up, basically summarize each theme. What I'm trying to evaluate or understand is your general understanding of the theme itself. And to do that, summarize the main ideas and then incorporate specific points from the lecture into your summary of the theme to demonstrate your understanding. Put your word count in after each summary of the theme, and theme summaries somewhere between 75 and 125 words per each theme. All right, so that is the format. Let's rock and roll. Let's move into the overview for this first week. Okay, so yeah, the goal here is provide you some foundation. If you've taken intro to sociology before, this is kind of a little bit of a review and maybe add to what you already know in terms of intro. If you haven't been in intro before, this will be all new information, but hopefully things will start to make sense as far as what the perspective of sociology is and how it can be applied to culture and popular culture, and a breakdown of the theories themselves. There's two required readings this week. Grazian is the author of a book called Mixing It Up, the Exploration of Popular Culture, Application of the Theories. There's one chapter on functionalism and popular culture and one on conflict theory. Those are the two required readings for the week. And then there's a third, the column article on 3 sociological perspectives. It's a great intro overview. It's not required reading, but highly recommended to read that to get an understanding of what the 3 theories are. All right, let's kind of start off with, social science is the first theme. So social sciences and sociology, so let's kind of put these in perspective. So sociology or social science is a lot of different fields, right? You got anthropology, the study of people and culture. That takes you to a lot of different potential places. Anthropology and sociology, there's a lot of overlap. We have our own distinct kind of areas and how we focus on things between those two different fields. But they both are seeking to understand culture and people. Anthropology focuses more on that aspect, culture, development of culture, practices within culture, those different aspects. Social sciences also include things such as history, right? History is an important part to understanding the past as well as the present. Sociology draws upon a lot of historical foundations. So for example, look at the mass media. To understand how the mass media operates today, we got to go back in time, understand the development of mass media, how it was organized and structured in the past, the influence of technology and media. Like these different historical foundations become important to understand the present. The field of economics, sometimes people put that in sort of the discipline of business, but it's actually a social science. It's a behavioral science. It's understanding through a different lens, understanding the choices that people make, to understand basically thinking about human behavior through that perspective about choice making and what influences the choices people make, and think about the influence of structure, culture, perhaps on those choices. Geography and other social sciences, there is the physical geography side, which may be more in the natural science, climate and geography, sort of the natural geography kind of component. And then there's cultural geography, which, you start to think about sort of the influence of geographic space on community and people and experience. So there is a sort of geography as a social science, psychology, of course, ranging from neuropsychology to social psychology, developmental psychology, understanding human behavior from that vantage point. And then sociology, this really eclectic field that draws upon a lot of different fields to understand human behavior and system behavior at large. So basically, the social sciences is an investigation of the human experience, kind of capture it that way. It's like trying to understand human experience at the micro, individual group level, all the way to community, societal level. So part of, we study society, a study of society, which includes a lot of different aspects: politics, history, culture, social structures, issues of power. All of that's required to understand the human experience. And why do we study the human experience? I mean, part of it's just humans are curious. They want to know, try to explain the social world. And it is complex. I joke with my friends in the natural sciences sometimes that, there's a sort of language of the hard sciences, which is natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and the soft sciences, meaning the social sciences. And sometimes there can be a little bit of a value judgment that the hard sciences are more technical, more empirically driven, employ the research, the classic research methods to do their work. I kind of joke with my friends over in the natural sciences that the hard sciences are actually in social sciences, because trying to understand systems and trying to understand the human experience, we can't control variables in a lab. Both fields, areas, the natural and the social sciences, are incredibly complicated. Social sciences has its own level of complications, because to understand the human experience requires understanding culture, social groups and processes, individual identities, issues of distribution of power, so many different things that go on to influence that. So part of it, we're curious. Part of it is we seek to understand, the social world today. We need to understand the past and how societies and structures move across time. And this is sort of like maybe more indicative of sociology. I mean, I'd say it's probably every discipline. Part of the rise of the disciplines in social sciences was to understand the social world in order to make remedies, to identify causes or influences on the human experience, and seek remedies to create more democratic structures, structures that operate more effectively for more people. So here's just a couple of different charts, kind of some things that may be related to popular culture, some things to kind of think about, like social sciences would engage in. This first chart here on the left, the number of hours people spend in digital media in the United States. Look, going back to 2008, it's almost a three-time increase in the amount of hours spent on digital media. And that can take us to a lot of different questions and start thinking about what's the impact of all that consumption of the media. We could start thinking about, well, who's constructing or shaping the content in the media? How does the media influence our engagement in social groups? How does it influence our own identity? What technologies have facilitated this accomplishment? So I don't know, there's some things that we could engage in. This is a picture of probably, I don't know, my guess would be the 1960s in a store front or in a store selling TVs. So think about life before the invention of the TV and to where we're at today. And that can take you to a lot of different places. Start thinking about the amount of consumption of media, the influence of media, the content of media, a lot of different aspects of that social world to understand the human experience. Part of it maybe it's kind of interesting looking at advertising, the amount of time on TV spent on advertising. I mean, advertising is a social influencing agent. It's marketing and development, and to some extent, as we'll get into later on in this class, is looking at the influence of branding and advertising on our consumption choices and our own identity. So a lot of influences. We could look at the social world. We could look at specific institutions, sports. The picture on the left there is Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. He's a semi-pro. I don't know if he was ever a professional tennis player, but is the famous Battle of the Sexes in the 1970s. The time period of the rise and the development of the feminist movement, the 1970s, Billie Jean King was a professional female tennis player. And he said that he could beat any woman, that males are basically more adept, stronger, better athletes than females. Became the famous Battle of the Sexes. A movie came out a couple of years ago, kind of a representation of that particular tennis match that happened. And anyway, so she won. And it was this sort of big theatrical kind of thing. And it was really important kind of moment in terms of kind of cultural history. So we could look at, social, trying to unpackage that, understand kind of the role of sports in society. Think about how sports is a reflection of gender relations, or the picture on the right about race relations. Think about the role, what are the roles and expectations of the athletes? When Kaepernick took a knee in terms of making a protest against treatment of African Americans in United States society and culture, created a lot of controversy. We as society are talking about that particular event, trying to make sense of it, trying to, weighing in terms of our own opinion and viewpoint on that. So a lot to kind of unpackage and start thinking about another aspect of thinking about popular culture. We could think about representations. Who's being represented? How are they being represented? If we look at the demographics in the United States in terms of just population, number of females and number of males, or look at distribution in terms of number of people in different racial categories. Then we started looking at, well, what's the representation on the screen? Is it similar? Is it different? If it's different, how is it different? Representations matter. They influence our understanding of the social world. So again, it's going back, if I can kind of go back, we investigate, try to understand the human experience. That can involve technology and change, institutions like sports. You can understand things like representation. And I will bring these up later on as we talk about the theories. Sociology defined is basically the systematic study of society. So we have our own tools in sociology to study society. You could talk about it, it's an informed perspective. We have theories and traditions to draw upon in the field. There can be, it's always difficult to talk about like opinions versus analysis. There's a lot of talking heads in media. There's a lot of people everybody has an opinion, different levels of information. I think, one way to approach thinking about social sciences or academic work in general, it's analysis that's shaped or influenced by research, empirical findings, and theory. It doesn't mean that 3 different sociologists aren't going to come up with 3 different maybe applications or understanding, but they're all more systematic ways of thinking about the social world. So we put things in context. So sociology is looking at that relationship between the individual and society, and also putting things in context to understand the human experience based on historical time period, influence of culture, economic forces, and other things that are shaping society and individuals within it. And the goal, ultimately, to understand and potentially provide some advocacy for social change. I think it's important to start off in this class, start thinking about the relationship between individuals and society itself. In part because in the American culture, we have this idea of the rugged individual, that individuals are basically, we see the individual, we don't recognize or discuss very often or highlight how social forces impact individuals. We think about individuals are basically make their own fate, in charge of their own fate. And to some extent, that's true. It's not that there's no influence of the individual on the environment, but we downplay the influence or misunderstand or misrepresent or underplay the influence of social forces. So we're going to start in this theme of thinking about social sciences. One way to get to that in sociology is to think about the relationship between the individual and social forces. Social forces could be, it's everything outside of the self. So history, culture, person's status, their social position, race, class, gender, other aspects of their identity, the influence of technology, all these things are outside of the individual experience that shape the individual. And there's different ways of understanding the relationship between the individual and social forces. There's sort of the things we develop like common sense. Well, that's just common sense. Oh, males are just better at math. They're just better equipped. They're just designed to be better at math. That's not empirically true. There's a lot of cultural and social forces that are operating in that. So there's a limitation to common sense. Common sense is what we've been socialized into, and that socialization may be inaccurate, but sometimes we hold on to that common sense, right? When confronted with information that is contradictory to that common sense, sometimes we try to protect the common sense. A lot of experience in academia, especially over a period of time, is we get confronted with this challenge to our common sense. And this will happen oftentimes in anthropology, sociology, and other social sciences. What we think to be true may not actually be true, or maybe only partially true. So we break down the common sense. We move away from common sense and try to do things, approach things with critical thinking skills, more rational thought, trying to understand things more systematically, empirical evidence. So finding research, identifying research, trying to objectify or understand the social world through investigation and through research. So as an example, I put here, I use my 201, my intro classes. For example, somebody might say, well, we're too soft on criminals. That's why we have a crime problem. It's just like with kids, if you don't give them consequences, they will do bad things. This is like a common sense kind of viewpoint. There's a lot of limitations to that perspective. This idea that if we just developed a more punitive system or incarcerated more people, that we would solve the crime problem, that it so misunderstands so many different social forces that are going on that are shaping human behavior. And it would bode us well to understand those social forces so that we can be in a better position to address those particular problems. We can talk about also like income inequality and teenage pregnancy as well. There's a strong correlation that the greater inequality in a society, there's a greater link to the rates of teenage pregnancy. That's a large social force, right? It's hard to think about things at that level of system because we tend to think about individual decision-making and hold the individual accountable without thinking about the individual within context. So our goal is to put the individual within context. One way to think about this is to think about a range between free will, the individual making choices without any social influence, or regardless of the social influence, it's the focus on the individual, versus determinism, social determinism, that the social environment determines a person's outcome. Neither of those are an accurate representation of reality. So we all have some degree of free will, or we all have free will, but the free will exists within context. And that's self-determination. Individuals making choices within context. Different individuals have different status positions, race, class, gender, which influences both the choices that are available to them as well as the consequences for those choices. So self-determination is where we're after in the social sciences, and sociology is trying to understand that interaction between the individual and society itself. Our values in the United States put us on the free will side. So we try to, social sciences can be, for those who are introduced to social sciences, it could be a shift in thinking to move towards this recognition of those social forces that are going on all the way from these very macro level things all the way down to the individual, and think about that relationship between the two. Okay, so that's basically social sciences and sociology in a nutshell. And that's kind of important work to think about the role of social sciences, the investigation of the human experience, think about the relationship between humans and the social world, and then kind of breaking down this idea that focus on trying to understand those social forces, the ways in which we are self-determined, individuals making choices within context. All right, let's move on to specific theories within sociology. We have three main branches of theories. Present these as kind of some general ideas with each of these theories. These theories are incredibly rich. There's a lot of information and applications of these theories. There's full-on, books written by different theorists about these theories. We're just going to kind of touch the surface of these theories. If you're interested in more, you can let me know. I can always share more information with you about the theories. So let me know. Theories are ways of thinking about the social world. They're frameworks. They're lenses that we put on that we can view the social world. So they give us terminology, they give us concepts, they give us ways of thinking, they provide a perspective about thinking about the world. We have these three different theories. They're each different perspectives. Sometimes the perspectives can be, they can contradict each other, or they can be at odds with each other. So the focus isn't to say that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. Rather, I think the ability is to say, which theory can we apply here in this situation that has the strongest case or the strongest argument to be made for it. So that becomes sort of what we're after is let's understand the theory, and then let's start to apply those theories to the social world. These are just some quotes. I won't kind of go over them, but there's some quotes if you want to kind of read them. This is, Karl Marx, our Marxist or conflict theory perspective. Harriet Martineau, a strong voice perspective to advocate for social change regarding the early feminist movement, integration of social sciences in terms of investigation. W. Du Bois, a key founder of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the first African-American to graduate from Harvard University in sociology, provides a lot of food for thought in terms of race relations. Emil Durkheim, our early kind of functionalist theorist, and Max Weber, who kind of crosses over, he's more in the interactionist realm, and a lot of his work was focused on understanding rationalization and the increased rationalization of the social world. So we have our three main theories. Here is functionalism, and one way to think about functionalism as a model of thinking about the society as a biological organism, it's an ecosystem. Then we have here our other macro level perspective. Maybe I should put this over here instead, move this over here and this over here to keep the macro and the micro apart. These are the macro big level views, functionalism and conflict theory. Conflict theory is our theory that we go to, or the theory that examines inequalities. It's a model of social justice for conflict theory. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Marxism, and especially in the United States, we have a long history of like this sort of very anti-Marxist perspective. People who have these ideas about Marxism, which aren't actually true to the ideas of Marx itself. But our goal here is we'll lay out some of the foundational kind of ideas of Marxism and how we can apply them. And this one over here is just an idea of thinking about interactionism, language and meaning and understanding is the interactionist perspective. Man, looking at the language around lipstick is super fascinating. Sexualization, gender stuff going on. It's really fun. Next time you're in a pharmacy or a department store, look at all the language around makeup, and it's really interesting. There's also a social class thing going on there too. Look at the different types of makeup and the lower priced items versus the higher priced items, and the language and how that changes. I mean, that's like super fun stuff to look at from a interactionist perspective. I'm not going to share this video here, but these lecture PowerPoints are available in Blackboard in the folder. You can watch this. I think this is a Khan Academy, KHAN Academy video on the three theories. May I encourage you, if you to read that column article, but if you don't read the article, watch a video on the theories, watch this one, watch another one. And there's a couple also in week one folder at the bottom of week one folder, a couple videos about the theories. And the more you can kind of start thinking about these theories, we'll use them throughout the course of the term. So the more you get grounded in them, the class will make more sense faster. All right, let's walk through the main ideas of the functionalist perspective. And when you're doing your write-up, you don't need to include all this information, right? So it's like, okay, what is functionalism in general? Sort of like, okay, what is it? And then maybe a couple different ideas to kind of get at sort of the functionalist perspective. What I want to do here is just kind of provide various different specific parts of what that perspective is. So society is a biological organism. It's like that's sort of the idea from a functionalist perspective, that society is a problem-solving entity. So every system wants to maintain balance and equilibrium. So this becomes actually, to go back a little bit in time, when Durkheim developed, early kind of like really framed sociology and the functionalist perspective in the 1800s, 1900s, he drew upon biology, the field of biology, and used the biological model and said, okay, if the biological system, then the natural world, we can apply that to the social world and use some of the same principles to make sense of the social world. So it has this very much of that ecosystem model, that societies are trying to maintain balance and order. If there's a threat to society, society adapts, makes change, tries to address those dysfunctions that are going on in the environment. So society is a problem-solving entity. Society is made up of a lot of different parts: the legal system, the education system, family, the criminal justice system, the mass media. There's all these different parts of the society to make society function well, and they're all interrelated. So you have an impact, for example, new technologies, the development of social media influences the economy, influences consumption, influences family, influences individual identity. So it's all these interdependent parts. One idea I think is really important for the functionalist perspective that distinguishes it from conflict theory, that's an important distinction, is that from a functionalist viewpoint, there's this idea that society is built upon a value consensus, that we have a core set of values that we all generally agree to. There may not be universal agreement, but we have these values that we uphold and say that are an important part of organizing our social system. So think about the Constitution, think about the Bill of Rights, think about the workplace and equal opportunity, employment. All these different things are a consensus of values, right? That are there that helps to form and support a social structure. From a functionalist perspective, it's important that people are integrated into social systems in a proper way or effective way. So people have a sense of belonging and connection and community, and that people are that we're regulating human behavior. So if there's things that are going on that are creating problems, we can regulate, or this idea of regulating to help ensure a strong social system. Anomie is sudden social change from a functionalist viewpoint, as with the biological system. If there's a lot of dramatic, fast change, the system can't adapt that fast, and it creates anomie, normlessness, struggle. You think about the immersion of social media has been a lot of anomie around that, and it takes a while for things to kind of settle down. Social dysfunctions are part of every system. And the goal from a functionalist perspective is to understand those dysfunctions, and ultimately that societies move to a place to managing what those are. The view of social change from a functionalist viewpoint is that change happens slow and gradual over a course of time, and that change happens within the systems themselves. This is a chart just kind of look at the issue of integration and the importance of integration. Durkheim studied suicide. That was one of his foundational studies, looking at suicide from a sociological perspective versus a lens of psychology. And what he's looking at is, what are those things external to the self that influence the self? And what he identified, he's looking for patterns of behavior, found that individuals who are divorced had a much higher likelihood of suicide than people who are single or married, had the lowest. These are degrees of integration, belonging, and connection shape the human experience. We can think about things like, the value consensus. There's a voice rising. The last few years with Black Lives Matter, right? They're changing value consensus to have debate and discussion about race relations in the United States. We can look here, the relationship. This is a gang. This is just for representation of kids playing sports. Sports are a way of integrating people into society. Gangs are a way of integration. It's kind of odd to think about. I think about gangs as being this major problem, which they can be. Another way of thinking about gangs, it's a way of gaining belonging and identity and feeling a sense of membership, status. You matter, right? So gangs are a functional adaptation to a dysfunction in their environment. This book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe, I think just kind of speaks to that. And it's a fabulous, interesting book. It's an easy read, and it's an engaging read. Basically looking at the importance of group to our own experience, and that we seek out, group membership for our own identity and for a sense of value and importance. This is a representation of a lot of different religions. Religion is an institution helping to integrate people into social systems. If we go back to our PowerPoint slide on media, we think about, one part about the media institution, interrelated parts, right? The media is shaping, influencing a lot of different institutions. You have the influence of technology on all these different forms of media. You have the influence of business and commerce in the media, and you have the impact where you have our engagement at the individual level in media, and then start to think about, these from a system level analysis and thinking about that sort of functionalist kind of viewpoint. Now let's kind of move to the conflict theory perspective. Is a different perspective. It focuses on the material structure, and think about, this is the language of the Marxist perspective, historical materialism. Materialism could be more differently defined, or a different word to say materialism would be economic structure, So an agricultural-based society versus a system of capitalism, two different material structures. And from a Marxist viewpoint, it's the material structure that drives the system. So capitalism is a focus on profit. That system of profit generating is what shapes the system itself. Agriculture society, is focused on a different logic. There's a different logic within that system. So think about the structure of family and how it operates differently in those two different environments. In an agricultural-based society, you can go back, let's say, early 1900s, 1800s, 1700s. Let's just say, think about agricultural-based society and how is community and how is family, how does it operate? Okay, that operates in one way. You go to industrial capitalism, modern day capitalism. Family and community are structured in different ways. And that's a reflection from a Marxist viewpoint about the material structure itself. In a system of capitalism, you have the owners of production, those who have the ruling class, those are the holders of power, or a lot of power, the bourgeoisie versus the working class, the proletariat. So Marx has this sort of viewpoint, or the Marxist perspective, that there's different groups, different degrees of power. The goal is to understand this, to move us to become more aware of class, race, gender consciousness, become more aware so that so people can advocate, we can create a model, a system that's more equitable, a system that's more just, a system that's more democratic. Rather than a system being built on value consensus, a Marxist perspective says that our system is based on value coercion. We're being coerced into values as a collective, and we need to become aware of what's going on in order to change that. So if I go back here to that chart and think about the role of advertising, I think a Marxist perspective would be that advertising is a way of value coercion, that it's turning us into consumers, it's shaping our identities, it's creating wants and needs that may be artificial, right? Go back to that lipstick and think about what we do in terms of our body and sort of modifying our body and aesthetics around the body, that's driven by capital. This would be the critique of advertising from a Marxist perspective. The social change model from a Marxist perspective is that radical restructuring is needed. So social change from a Marxist perspective, it's about a shift in the material structure itself. So it's about reinventing the system to a much greater degree, a much more significant degree than the functionalist viewpoint. So this is a theory that gets us into race theory, critical race theory, or feminist theory, queer theory, to address these areas of inequalities in society itself. Just different examples. I guess, we won't go through all these examples. I guess I have it here. I should probably talk about it a little bit, talk about degrees of inequality and how they've changed between the average CEO and the average worker, just kind of an indication that there's a lot of power at the top in terms of corporate world. Oprah Winfrey, talk show host back 80s, 90s, 2000s. She was sued by the meat industry. She said on her show one time, she said, I think it was a time period when E. coli outbreak, and she just said she would not eat hamburger or something. And she was sued by the beef industry for food libel laws. That's, for me, it's like this sort of indication like, well, whose values is that represented? Well, this sort of value of you as a public person, you cannot speak against a particular industry. That's about protecting the industry itself. Immigration, a lot of history in terms of anti-immigration focus in the United States. A lot of that's about issues of power. Think about monument building in the United States. A lot of those monuments to the Confederacy are built during time period of the rise of the racial movements. Black Power, going back to two different waves of kind of the civil rights movements. And in both of those, that a lot of these monuments were being erected. And that's kind of, this thing about power going on. Think about conflict theory, relationship to sports, gender equity, issues of race, politicalization, the political, bringing politics into sports, NFL games and flyovers by the military, and then having sort of Kaepernick. There's politics going on within these systems, and it's how we think about these systems from that conflict theory view. Okay, so that's much more macro level. Now we kind of get to the micro level. Interactionism gets a little confusing because it can be this focus on a few different things. It's that micro level, but sometimes we have to kind of dabble into the macro level to understand the micro level kind of stuff. The focus from interactionism or focus on language, symbols, meaning. This is a editorial cartoon, kind of addressing mascots of Native Americans. So we have this sort of the Cleveland Indians mascot, and saying, well, we would not have a mascot for these other groups. Why would we have these stereotypical depictions of Native Americans? So that's kind of like looking at symbols, right? Where do those symbols come from? What's their meaning? How do we understand them? This is kind of a really powerful short video on Proud to be a Mascot, kind of why mascots are problematic from a Native American point of view or this organization's point of view. So the focus here is on perceptions and meaning, self-concept and identity, like understanding of self, understanding of other. One way of thinking about symbolic interactionism is that we have a response, our reaction, our behavior. We have the stimulus, we have the thing, something that we see, something happens, but before that symbol and the outcome becomes an interpretation, right? So it's the focus is on the interpretation from the interactionist viewpoint. So if we can think about, it's how we interpret the world that shapes how we respond to the world. Example I often use is looking at marijuana, for example. So marijuana is a stimulus, it's a substance, but it's like, let's just say it's the object, it's the thing. Our response in terms of, maybe you go back to the 1930s, 1940s that we criminalized marijuana. We start to develop a Federal Bureau of Narcotics to criminalize marijuana. That response is based on an interpretation that marijuana is causing criminal activity, murder, rape, sexual assault, all these different kind of things. That leads to the response. So the focus, it's the interpretation. So there's a theorem in sociology called the Thomas theorem. If you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So it's how we define things determines our response, either individually or collectively. So our focus here is on that interpretation level. Meanings come out of social interactions. Social interactions take place within a context. Weber is related to, he's kind of like, he's an interpretive sociologist, an interactionist interpretive, maybe a better word than interactionist, but he falls under this umbrella a little bit because his focus is on understanding and thinking about how systems, rationalization, modernization, bureaucracies, the development, these are big structures, right? These big changes in terms of social organization. Don't get too focused on this. I'm going to bypass this and just kind of introduce you to the idea of Weber, and we'll come back to him later on. So think about Walmart versus Target. How do we individually think about these two different places? What perceptions do we have about them? How do they change across social group and time? That's interactionist stuff. Gender, language around gender, language symbols, meaning, interaction, all that kind of stuff. Native American mascots, all that stuff, interactionism. Think about representations in the mass media. Representations shape levels of understanding. What are the roles that people of color occupy in film, that white people occupy in film? What are the role of women in film versus males in film? Go down the list, right? Representations are, if we go back to this, representations shape our interpretation. So if we see people of color and males of color, commonly being gangsters and criminals within mass media, to what degree does that shape our perceptions of those particular social groups? And again, I was in a store, I don't know, like a year or two ago. I brought this up before about lipstick and stuff like that, but this is a picture from my phone. I was standing there waiting in line, and I just looked over and I just started looking through all the language for, this is nail polish. And I was like, oh man, this is super unwrap me. A lot of fun, naughty, not nice. All this gendered stuff was super fun for me to kind of go into. And this is like a different class level in terms of products, maybe, it's like, it's the language is shifting. And part of it may be an age thing as well. And I was trying to think of an equivalent for male, like a product for males, and started thinking, well, we don't have nail polish or makeup. It's sort of looking at condoms is this sort of very masculine identification around condoms, right? Trojan, Magnum, all this sorts of very masculine kind of stuff. So that's all interpretive kind of things. Okay, so you're probably going, man, how do I summarize all of that in 75 to 125 words? I think this section is probably the biggest challenge. I think that for theme 1 is a little bit easier. So I'd say for theme 2 and trying to summarize that, is kind of maybe just a few sentences about all three theories. What's the main ideas of those theories? Maybe bring a couple specific things in there. I mean, you'll fill up that space in no problem at all. I don't want you to stress too much in terms of like, man, I feel like I got to cover everything. You do not have to cover everything. I'm looking for your general level of understanding, that you're engaged, that you're processing information from these lectures. This first week is a lot of specific content that way. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging, I think, than in future weeks. And finally, just to let you know, I think it's important as you kind of get introduced, maybe you're new into the college experience, you're trying to figure out what do you want to do with your life, what are some career options. And I wanted to sort of take this time to say, hey, look, if you're interested in the social sciences, you're interested in sociology, but you're like, man, but what do I do with it? There's a lot of different places you can go with sociology specifically. You can go to working in mental health, human development, counseling, pre-law. You can go, these are some different backgrounds to go into. One of that some are not aware of. I definitely was not aware of when I started school. I wasn't aware of all this stuff, but public policy is a rich area, a lot of occupational opportunities that are really they're basically what public policy is working on social issues and problems through institutions, right? So you have like homelessness, affordable housing, mental health. These are public policy related stuff. There's specific programs. There's public sociology. There's public policy programs. Oregon State University has you can get a advanced degree in public policy. And there's a lot of occupational opportunities in those areas. If you want to talk about that in more detail, whether it's this term or down the road, and you go, oh man, maybe I'll think about public policy. It sounds like a pretty cool field. Let me know. I'd be more than happy to chat with you about that field. All right, so that's it for now. Have a great week. If you have any questions, let me know. Peace and be well.